over to Sam to talk about authorization patterns in Node.
Cool. Thank you very much for the intro. Okay. Can everyone see? Okay, I see thumbs. Good. Excellent. And that's a good reminder and a good start that I really would love and encourage people to interact as much as possible. We're a pretty sizable group, but I suspect generally not everyone wants to necessarily participate and talk, but I really would encourage as much as possible. I'm more than happy to pause, go back over something, elaborate, whatever you all want. So in particular, if you see me staring up here, it's because I'm staring at like the Zoom chat and the participant list and all that. So raise a hand, do whatever the hell you want to get my attention, unmute yourself and ask, just go ahead. I'd really appreciate it because it can get tiring just being the only one speaking. Okay, so with that, hello everyone. I'm Sam, the co-founder and CTO at Oso. So we are a startup. We're primarily sort of half the company is based in New York City. It was more than that pre-COVID times, but we had to adapt, as many companies have. But it's been great, and because now we've gone remote, and we have people as far flung as the Netherlands who are part of the company, and it's kind of made it awesome. We my co-founder and I, we really created Oso around this shared vision of making security very broadly more accessible and easier for developers. One of the areas we started in authorization, but the company itself is kind of setting our sights higher on really making various areas of security easier for developers. And so a big part of that for us is around putting out content, whether it's meetups, blog posts, and we have a full series of guides on authorization called Authorization Academy. Just generally putting stuff out there, trying to like help people understand authorization. It's something we found that like not enough people are kind of going out there and speaking about. We get it. It's not like the most sexy, fun topic in the world, but pretty much every app will need it, and it can actually be kind of fun when you get it right. And we'll see some of that later. So these are kind of like, this is my very brief agenda. I'm going to give like a little bit of background on authentication, authorization, and some patterns, as the title suggested. And I'm going to speak a little bit about what Oso is, how it kind of fits into all of this. So to get started, authentication, think about that moment you go to your desktop, you take your mobile phone, and you like enter your username and password, right? This is authentication, like who you are. Authorization is kind of the piece that often comes afterwards, which is like, now that I know that I've logged in as Sam, Sam can read document 12, but he cannot read document number 4, right? So this is a very, very simple example of the authentication authorization paradigm. Authentication is who you are, authorization is what you can do. So to take it to maybe a little bit more of a real world application here, hopefully most of you are familiar with GitHub. I'll be using it a lot for examples tonight, so hope you're familiar. In GitHub, right, you typically go and you go visit the website, and it maybe asks you to log in, right? Pops you up with this username and password, maybe asks you to do 2-factor, and then you've authenticated successfully. I'm signed in as Sam Scott 89. But the authorization piece is maybe not quite so obvious when it happens. So for example, one of the ways that I could kind of like try and see this in action was by visiting these 2 different URLs. Basically, the top one here, if you can't read it, is visiting the Oso HQ organization's teams. The second one is visiting the Nest.js teams. So I can see, when I go to the top, the first one, sure, I can see Oso's teams. That's great. But for the Nest.js one, it gives me this like different page, and it says you're not a member of any teams in this organization. And this is again like an example of authorization happening, but it's one that's like very much like woven into the application here, and like as this kind of behavior. And the reason that we are kind of like focusing on authorization as an area to build tooling around is because we've found that typically most people just kind of do it a little bit ad hoc. They'll add if statements when they're needed. Like a common one might be checking that the user is viewing their own profile, not somebody else's, or things like that. And so often authorization comes up with this kind of ad hoc process of just kind of adding the random pieces of logic as you go about building your application. But what that can kind of lead to is this situation where you end up with these kind of like horrible nested if statements and switch things, and it's kind of hard to follow what the hell's going on here. You have to really like stare at it and be like, case action create, if the role is guest, then return false. Okay, so maybe then the guest can't create and things like that. And so basically, what we want to do is kind of provide a way to help people structure these kinds of things better. Like, this role thing going on here, what's that all about? And like, how can I represent this logic without needing to have this kind of like somewhat error-prone approach? So let's talk about roles. I have a bit of like this love-hate relationship with roles. I think they're both very cool and powerful, but also have a bit of a horrible like reputation, and like just lots of people don't just like it's kind of associated with like a really annoying, painful ABAC thing and stuff like that. So I'm gonna talk about like what they look like when they're done well, basically. So okay, so to start off with, so first of all, there's like another term that you might have heard, ABAC, which stands for role-based access control. Security world loves their acronyms, so they love talking about RBAC and ABAC. But really, we're just talking about like roles and this concept of role. So what is a role, right? So coming back to the idea of authorization, right? You need to decide who can do what in your app. And starting out, you sort of have this image that I've showed here, which is like kind of this fully unstructured view where it's like, okay, I have some users and I have some documents. How can I decide who can do what? Like, do I need to go individually and grant access? So the idea of roles is to say, well, really, there's only kind of two kinds of users in my app. I've got the people who are the administrators, and then like everyone else is just a regular member. And by like kind of doing this grouping, I can then really forget about just how many users I actually have and just think about my authorization in terms of these like two roles. And so I can say maybe members can read and write, admins can also delete, maybe they can invite other members, things like that. So that's like kind of the crux of roles, and I think why they've become so popular is massively simplifies your potential authorization. So again, coming back to like maybe a more of a practical example, GitHub has role-based access control. GitLab as well does. GitLab has a little bit nicer documentation, so I'm showing theirs. This shows like a little slice of their role permission table. So where they've basically, at the top here, they've listed the different roles you can be inside the GitLab application. And then there's, the actions is all the permissions and all the things that you're allowed to do based on which role you have. And I think what's really nice about these is like, these are very friendly and kind of nice to read. And I can see, for example, a developer is allowed to publish packages. And so I think like if you're using the GitLab app, you can kind of quite easily find out what role you need in order to get certain permissions. But I think there's like another really powerful piece of this like GitLab example is that they've stuck with very I would say like kind of intuitive names for what they use as roles. They've really tried to relate them to the true meaning of a role, meaning like I'm just going to say the word role so many times. You think about what a role means. Like your role at a company is like maybe who you are or like the things you're expected to do at the company, right? So in this case, a GitLab developer is presumably someone who develops applications managed by GitLab. You'd probably expect that they are able to do things like edit the code, because that's what developers tend to have to do. But a reporter, they probably don't need to edit the code, right? A reporter sounds like someone who reports issues, I'm guessing, right? So I suspect they've maybe got just like a read, kind of some sort of like a read view into the repository, but they're also able to interact with it and open issues, right? So they've got these like really great labels here that help you understand, what you can do in the app. And so like some of the stuff I've been speaking about here, like lead to some of these like best practices for doing roles. I think you really should try and have like a small number of them. Like one of the traps people fall into is every time they have like a use case that sounds a little bit different, they're just like, oh, just add another role. And then you end up with like a, like super developer and partial maintainer and all these kinds of additional weird roles that fit into different categories, and it's really hard to understand them. I guess similarly, right, you kind of want these to relate to, as I was saying previously, like an intuitive concept of your responsibility in the app. And I think kind of like the final piece of like, because what I just gave you there was maybe not very helpful. It's like, okay, cool, like there shouldn't be many of them, they should be intuitive, but like what if my use case is complex? Then actually there's often this, there's often the an approach where you can achieve more granularity by like splitting by a resource. And so what I mean by that is, in the case of say GitLab, I can be a maintainer of a whole organization or a project. So I can also be a maintainer of a single repository. And that gives me really good control over granularity, because I can add someone to be just a maintainer of one repository, not of like the whole organization. And I think that's what helps them avoid like needing too many roles. So there's another infosec term of ABAC, another acronym, unfortunately, which comes up a lot. Like people often talk about RBAC and ABAC as these two ideas. So what is, if you've heard about that, what is that all about? So like RBAC was role-based access control, ABAC is just attribute-based access control. So roles and attributes are really the key things here. And the kind of idea of attributes is we're going to go back to the model where we really do want to think about the user and the thing they're trying to access, the document or the expense or the repository. And in this case, we are going to like consider like what they can do directly, but we're going to do it sort of based on attributes of the two things. So for example, you might say that users can read documents if they're in the same project that the user belongs to. Or you might say that only staff can read protected documents. And so, you can see in this case, right, we're sort of comparing two attributes, this protected field on the document or the expense or whatever it might be. And so this is kind of like the crux of attribute-based access control. So I say like people often like comparing RBAC and ABAC and like which one should we choose. At OSO, and what we've been trying to kind of help people understand is like that's really not a very useful like dichotomy to create, especially because often those terms don't really come with a very good definition, and like a lot of things kind of look like roles, and attributes is just so incredibly vague, it kind of just means everything. So instead, like what we try and really focus on is describing your authorization in terms of natural concepts you have in your application already, and particularly in your existing data models. And so that this means things like belonging to a project or user creating a document. If a user create a document, you might have a field of who's the creator. And roles can be a nice way of sort of augmenting some of those relationships. So you don't just belong to a project, but you have a role in a project, and now you have like sort of tiers of different kinds of access that you can have by belonging to a project. And attributes can be very good for like additional granularity. So, a really simple example might be anybody can read a repository if it's public, and that's just like very nice, quick one-off thing to do. That it's good if you can encapsulate that inside your authorization logic, instead of kind of dealing with it as like some weird special case. Okay, so where does OSO fit into all of this? So basically, OSO is an open source library for authorization, and it's kind of like a few key pieces of this. So first of all, as I said, it's a library, and the main idea of that library is it helps you make those authorization decisions in your application, and it helps you enforce them, helps you do things like simple, can this be allowed, yes or no, all the way down to like what are all the things this user should be allowed to see. And like the really cool part of it is that it just takes in your application data as an input. So it really is just like it's just a regular library effectively. Because there's some systems that require you doing this sort of awkward back and forth, or like shaping your data in a particular way so you can ask these kind of authorization decisions. But we're just like, we'll work with your JavaScript classes and your attributes and methods and things like that. And yeah, so indeed, like to install this, right, it's npm install OSO. That's kind of about it. It's available through various package managers, things like that. We actually support a bunch of different languages with OSO. So for example, like Python and Rust as kind of like two different examples. So the second piece of OSO, and this is really where we start coming back to those like patterns I've been speaking about, is what we're calling like this batteries included approach. And the idea is that we want to take the kinds of information that I've been telling you tonight around how you should think about structuring roles and relationships and how to build that into your application, and just basically giving you a template that just really just asks you, like, just gives you that as the thing you get to strive towards. Like, you need roles, here's a role template, fill this out and you're good to go. And don't worry too much about like have I done this in the right way? And that just kind of like encodes all of our best practices basically. So if you want to not think about how to implement roles, you don't want to read I think we're like 15,000 words and counting authorization academy guides, you just want to get this out of the box, like that is what OSO is there for. And I'll show you some examples of what that looks like in later on. And so the final piece of OSO, and in some ways kind of the core piece that powers it all, is made up of these two components: the policy and like the application code, the library interface. So the idea is we have a policy language that we built specifically for authorization, and the idea of this is for representing authorization logic. So all the kinds of things I've spoken about tonight, whether it's roles, whether it's you can read public repositories, whether it's using attributes, things like that. And it gives you a very, very clean way to structure that logic in a very reusable way. And in particular, like avoiding lots of like nested if-else statements. And I'll show you just why that is in a second. And the sort of the reason that this like policy language is so useful, so powerful, is that it means that you can basically put all of your authorization logic and all of that kind of complexity behind just this single JavaScript method, oso.isAllowed. And you can just use this everywhere, basically. So anywhere you need to make authorization decisions, oso is allowed, you pass in, say the user in the repository, and you get back that decision. All right, so I'm going to walk you through. I'll take a pause here. If there's any of that stuff that people have questions over or want me to go back on before I start sharing some code, please do let me know. I'll get some water. Okay, I am not seeing anything. Cool. All right, so I want to show you a little bit kind of what this looks like in practice. So I'm going to start with the OSO policy. I think it's a nice place to start to really start getting to grips with that that policy logic, that authorization logic, and what's going on there. So the way that you express authorization logic in with OSO, so as I said, it's in this policy language called Polar, and you do so by writing what we call rules. Now, rules sort of look like methods, and you can kind of think of them as similarly as like a similar concept. And the sort of as a convention, like the kind of entry point to authorization decisions is through an allow rule. So I can write allow, and it takes in 3 inputs, what we call an actor, an action, and a resource. I just saw a comment from Martin. Yes, there will be recordings, I think, on YouTube afterwards. I think they'll be sent out in an email afterwards. No worries, no worries. Okay, so yeah, so an allow rule takes in these 3 inputs: an actor, an action, and a resource. So the actor is, often could be the user, but it could also be, some other kind of type. It could be, you might have multiple user types, like your regular user, but you might have like a customer support member, something like that. But I think for our purposes, you can think about actor as the user. The action is like, what are they trying to do? Is it a read? Is it a write? Is it delete? Is it edit? Things like that. And the resource is what they're trying to do it to. So a resource might be a document, a repository, things like that. I just saw a question from James. Is admin an actor? You can kind of think about roles like a type of actor. I'll get into like admin specifically in a second. So it's a great question though. So so for example, I could write user, and the action I'm going to say is read, and for the resource, let's just say a repository. And then basically what follows, you after an if statement, you then write like the conditions for which I want this rule to be true or not. And basically what I'm expressing here is a user is allowed to read a repository under these conditions. And I could just write true. User is always allowed to read a repository. This is like unconditionally true all the time. I could also just write false. Like there wasn't really any purpose of me writing this because I could have just omitted it and it would have been false by default. But for example's sake, I can write conditions like this. But I can get more. I can go a bit deeper than this. And to kind of explain what's happening here, I'm going to talk a little bit about this syntax. So here where I have written, this user : user, this is where I'm kind of starting showing some of the kind of early pieces of our support for the like application data and application types. So basically, we support doing things like rule matching based on the input types. And so here I'm saying check that the first argument user is of type user, where a user would be a class defined in my JavaScript app. Similarly, I'm expecting repository to be a repository class instance coming from the app. Read's just the string read. I'm just going to make sure that the match on that. But so these user and repository, they really are just my objects, my JavaScript objects coming from my application. So I can do things. I see a question. I'll answer that in a sec. So I can just start accessing things like attributes and methods on these. So for example, I could say, I don't know, user.email equals, I don't know, sam@example.com. I can start reading attributes off of my classes. I can maybe start comparing them. So maybe user.id is equal to the repository. I can't spell repository dot, I don't know, owner ID or something like that. And so I can start basically writing very simple. I can start writing rules like this to say who can have access to my app based on conditions using my data, which is what I would have done like naturally in JavaScript. But I'll show you in a second like where this starts getting really powerful by doing this in Polar. I see a question, is this the early stage of TypeScript support? So we're actually fully compatible with TypeScript and can equally use any objects passed in from JavaScript or TypeScript. So for those who aren't like familiar with TypeScript, right, it's effectively a JavaScript with types, and so it has very similar syntax like this, where you can write when you write your methods, you can express the type. The kind of the interesting difference here, and part of the sort of power of using OSO, is that whereas in like regular languages, like something like TypeScript, those are used as like type checking, so that if I pass in the wrong type, it's going to give me a compilation error and I won't be able to build my app. The difference here is that we're using these to actually decide whether these rules apply to my question or not. So I could, for example, instead write on, and maybe I have repository issues as well. So maybe I have two resource types. I've got repositories and I've got issues and repositories. So I can actually, by specifying different types in these rules, I'm basically asking OSO just to evaluate only the ones that match my input data. And the idea here, and why this can be really powerful, is I can now start writing like all my authorization logic for all my different types. And I don't need to like tell OSO, if it's a repository, try this one. If it's an issue, try this one. If it's a comment, try this one. If it's a PR, try this one, and on and on and on. I just, it can like work that out for me. And so that's kind of like one of the differences here. But yeah, so we're using those input types. And so this is kind of like the kind of early piece of like what's going on here is you can express your logic, you can use things like attributes, you can compare them, you can use operations like less than or equal to, or add things and things like that. And where this gets really powerful is when we kind of turn back to like look at the application. So I have here a Nest.js application. The kind of the stuff I'm showing is for no real reason, the Nest.js app, but it just kind of give you an idea of how this looks in like a concrete application. So in my Nest.js app, for example, I've got my methods that handle fetching documents in this case. And so that's here in my find one method. So find one takes in an ID and it's going to return some, it's going to return a promise with the found document at the end of the day, kind of thing. Now the nice thing is, we might have a bunch of very complicated logic about who can read a document, right? It's like maybe you wrote the document, maybe you're invited to the document, maybe the document belongs to a project that you're a member of, maybe you're in the right organization. You know, there's all this logic, but we just hide it behind this single authorized method. And this same authorized method we can use in multiple places. Maybe it's where I need to get lots of documents. Maybe it's where I need to edit the document. Like in every case, I just have this like one little authorized method that's going to basically say, let's go and ask the policy if this should be allowed or not. And it means you get to keep your application business logic, like the some ways like the real part of your application, like actually doing its job. You get to keep that like uncluttered from all this. I had that like full page of like if they're a role or an admin or things like that, which can really just distract from the core logic. There is one thing I do want to point out here, because I think it's very common to see this kind of thing maybe being handled in like a middleware. So often on the request path, you often will apply like maybe various processing steps, middleware things. Maybe there's like logging or authentication even, and then you'll like route the request to the specific method. And so it can feel very like tempting. Oh, I should do authorization in the middleware. I just get to do it once and kind of forget about it. The thing that's tough with that is there's kind of a trade-off there. It prevents you from doing fine-grained authorization on like the object itself, because you sort of only have access to like the request data, and the request data might have like the document ID, but if you want to go and find out the user is whether the user is in the same project as the document, you're going to have to hit the database, and you want to avoid doing that in like a request middleware. It's kind of really breaking that separation. And so once you kind of like follow that logic through and you're like, well, authorization, it'd be really good if I could apply it just after I fetched like the actual class itself. Then you kind of see that like, oh, it's actually really nice if I can just do a very quick authorization check afterwards. Okay, so like with those two pieces, it's like, all right, cool. We have this kind of method to express authorization logic. We got this like kind of one-line way that I just get to add that to my application. I kind of now want to bring it back to some of the stuff I was talking about around the like OSO batteries included, those like templates for things like roles. So what I'm going to do is first I just want to walk through a couple of like example. Sorry about that. A couple of example data models for roles, and these are data models you can go and apply in your application today with or without OSO basically. So here is a very, very simple role data model that I think is it can be for a lot of people starting out can be absolutely sufficient, and like go ahead and do it. But I'll talk about the limitations soon. Basically what it looks like, right, is you have your your users table, right? It might have user ID, the name, and you basically just have foreign key, an organization ID, which points into your organization table. I should clarify as well, like a lot of this, right, is and this is in like the kind of talk description, like a lot of this is focusing on B2B, business to business applications, where organizations or some concept of like a tenant is often like one of the first things you need to deal with. And so like the most straightforward approach, I have users, I have organizations, and I just have a nice like relationship between them. And if I need to specify a role in that organization, right, it's admin or member, or it's developer, maintainer, things like that, I can just put that as a string on my table. It's like nice and straightforward. So then what might like the authorization logic look like? So the idea is, instead of writing these kind of like conditional one-offs, we can start like pulling out that role logic instead. So maybe I'll say, allow a user to do any action to any resource. Yeah, start with that. If a user is in a role, let's specify the. Do we specify the resource at this point? Yeah, let's just say this is organization for now. So let's say a user is allowed to perform an action for an organization if the user has a particular role for that organization, and we want to make sure the role allows them to perform that action. Yeah, let's keep it as like a little simple one like this for now. And so, okay, so what I'm starting to do is I'm starting to like build up some like more abstract authorization logic. And again, this is kind of the benefit of this like separate language for it, is it allows me to start pulling out patterns and kind of having reusable logic. So my user and role, this is what I've just been talking about with my data model before. So what did I have, right? I had an organization ID on the user, and I have an organization role field. So what this looks like is basically user.organization ID equals, I need to check that it matches the organization's ID. And the role is going to be equal to the organization role field. I should point out here, because this is a part of the language that often trips people up a little bit. So this language, it works. It's a kind of declarative logic-based language, so it doesn't follow necessarily the same flow as like a regular like language like JavaScript. So in particular, like this like role variable, for example, you'll see I said like use and role, and I magic role from thin air, and this is like perfectly valid in the language. It's basically saying a variable, if you haven't specified what value it has, it's just a variable with no value, and that is perfectly fine. But when I thread it through to this rule, this user and role rule, by this equality check here is basically going to set the value if it wasn't set otherwise. So there's actually a couple of ways I could use this. I could write here like admin, and this rule is going to check that the user, this evaluation of the rule will check that the user has the admin role. But by just saying role, I'm saying effectively what role does the user have in the organization. So it kind of has that like flexibility to it. So okay, so I have my logic now, which is going to find out what role the user has for the organization. And now I just basically want to check, well, is the user allowed to, I've reduced my problem to just saying, what's the role allowed to do? And so I can imagine just, listing these out. So I'm going to say, an admin can do an action if the action is in, I don't know, create a repository. Maybe it's list repositories. Maybe it's invite member. I'm going to go off the screen here, but whatever. I guess I could put this down a line, right? So maybe the admin can do all of these kind of things, and I'm only going to allow member to list repositories. And so kind of here I have my like my kind of initial role-based access control model implemented that's going to like work in my application. Okay, so like we're off to a good start. We got some things working. Now, one of the things that might happen is that, depending on the kind of app you're building, that you might find that this having just one user in one organization is actually too limiting. So you think about GitHub, you can belong to, I think as many as you want, but it might be capped at like 32 organizations in GitHub. Like I don't just have just one organization I'm in. So when that's the case, you need to be able to support, instead of just this like, what would it be, many to one relationship, you might need many to many. So the model for this looks, basically we just need to add a little extra through table that can handle those extra relationships, right? So now we maybe have many, for every user might have many roles over different organizations and things like that. So now I have a through table between the user and the organization, and I'm just keeping the role field now just in that table. And so again, like in our logic, we can go and we could go and represent that by maybe something like, so first of all, we would need some way of fetching all these roles for the user. So maybe we just have like a method on it. So for role in, let's say the user dot organization roles, this could be making like maybe a database query or something like that. So we want to check for every role in the organization roles, and the role organization ID is equal to the organization. Oh, I guess we're basically back here already. Look at that, nice and easy. And no, role is the thing we were using up here. Org role, that looks better. So I called it role, right? Yeah, so many roles. So I'm going to look through all the users organization roles. I'm going to check that this is the right, I have the right one. So this is kind of going to evaluate like a for loop, where every time that the next condition is false, it's going to like kind of go to the next one. So this is taking a declarative approach. It's like find me an organization role in the user's roles where the organization ID matches, and in that case the role is going to be equal to the role field on the org role. And at this point, I'm actually done. Like my previous logic sits there and continues to work fine. All I've done is changed the way that I determine if a user has a role or not. And that's kind of like the cool, powerful thing here. But sometimes, and I mentioned earlier that actually, if if I want to be able to like these actions, these permissions are quite broad. Like if I want to be able to go fine grained and say, what can an admin do to a particular repository, things like that. I might need to go down another level and have things like repository roles. And so at that point, I need to basically take this same model, and this exact same table here effectively works the same way for extending it to repository roles. Oh, that does not look nice. Let's auto arrange. Oh, did I might have messed with this one. No. Do I have history? I do. Not in free mode. Okay, I need to get it from OSO Authorization Academy. This is a good time for me to plug the OSO Authorization Academy. So basically, a lot of the stuff I'm talking about today, we've captured in a series of guides. And a lot of this role stuff comes from our guide on modeling roles, where it walks you through these different models that I spoke about, like how to implement the logic and things like that. Cool. And so I was going to show you this one. So just like we had users, organization roles, organizations, we can do the same thing with users, repository roles, and repositories. And I'm not going to take you through the same logic, the same steps as before to show you how to do it in OSO like this. But instead, what I want to show you is like, you might be at this point like, I don't have to write all this stuff. Like, if you already know what I'm going to do, can you just give it to me? And that is exactly what we're currently working on. And so we've just recently released support for kind of in early access for just giving you like an out-of-the-box way of doing roles. And basically what it asks you to do is just write in Polar in this declarative way what you want to have in your application from a role standpoint. So you basically say, I have a resource. So my resource type is organization, and I'm going to tell you the actions and the kind of like role definitions. And basically you just need to like fill out this information, right? So the possible actions in organization, we had like, I don't know, invite member and list repositories, things like that. And then the definitions is basically just like a map of the roles you want to have in your application. So we said we would have like an admin role, and the admin role has permissions that, invite member, list repositories, create repo, things like that. And we can also have a member role, and we just fill out. And basically just with this piece, so I've just kind of, oh, that was, should we member? Say list repositories. Basically with that, I'm done. This is all that you need to tell OSO in order for us to be able to give you the full like role implementation for organizations. And you can do the same thing for repositories. And you don't need to go and implement the logic for doing these things. You can do it for repositories. Maybe this is like, maybe repositories just have push and pull. We have, I don't know, maintainers. Maintainers can push and pull. Maybe a guest can just pull. And so you can define all your different types of roles you need over different resources, and you can basically start doing there's like a bunch of other stuff that we've kind of spelled out in details and examples that really covers pretty much, I'd say, like all the bases for everything you might need to do with roles. So one thing you might have noticed is like there's been a lot of duplication here. I had to say push and pull and pull, like, or admin and member can do all these things, but sure, the admin can just do anything a member can do. Why do I need to repeat this? So we have this idea of implications. So sure, admin, if you have admin, it implies that you are a member. And by doing that, I don't need to repeat the same like permissions everywhere. And as I add read repository to a member, admin gets it automatically. I see a question from Ron. Is the content of OSO demo a DSL? Yeah, so everything I'm writing here is in our policy language called Polar. And the kind of core idea of Polar is to let you express authorization logic using rules. And it's declarative and logic based. And so the first piece looks like a rule like this, like checking simple attributes. But this kind of like piece I'm giving you a very quick like snapshot demo of is some of our like new work we have, which allows you, it's kind of like a DSL in Polar that allows you just to say, here's the roles I want to have, like also go off and handle all the logic for me. So you imagine like, you don't need to come up with these fields, these like actions definitions in this structure. We just give you that as like a blank template. And indeed, it can do everything from like, admin implies member. You can actually like relate organization and repository. So if you want, organization admin to be by default a repository maintainer, you can specify this in the config, and it's all just like handled for you. Okay, so with that, I covered everything I wanted to talk about tonight. Thank you all very much for listening and for for the questions throughout. Oh, I didn't come back to his admin and actor. Let me talk about that one very quickly. So in some ways, so this role allow that I used earlier often also takes a resource field, and in this way you can see it's like almost identical to matching the same allow user action resource, like role allow, role action organization. So you absolutely could, you definitely could just consider like think about a role as a different kind of actor. Maybe just make this an allow query, and then here you maybe like make sure this is a string. You definitely could think of them, but we tend to prefer to differentiate these like more directly. So I just saw that question from earlier. I wanted to come back to. So in this case, admin could be a different kind of actor. You may though also have, it's quite a common like use case people have is like some idea of like a super admin, in which case you can just write like allow, if you have like a special class, allow admin do anything. James, I see you have a hand raised. How's it going, James?
Good. Thanks for the demo, by the way, tonight. That was pretty cool.
Thank you.
So just two quick questions. Well, twofold. One, I wanted to clarify something you said earlier. You said that this was meant to, I wasn't sure if you said to avoid database hits altogether, or was it just to avoid database hits from the middleware? Because it looks like it's still hitting the database.
Yes, yeah, great clarification. Mostly from the middleware. So there's a short answer and there's a longer answer. The shorter answer is like, yeah, just from the middleware. Like when you're doing the authorization checks themselves, you almost certainly will need to hit the database, to evaluate the data models, check for roles, things like that. The longer answer I won't go into, but effectively we actually support pushing the handling all the authorization logic at the database layer as well, so that you do it as just like a one-off check, like a one-off round trip is fetch the repository and at the same time do my authorization logic, which is kind of like a nice way to like bundle them together.
Gotcha. All right. So it's just to like keep things happening like kind of concurrently.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. And then my next part of that question, I'm sorry if this is taking up a lot of time. The two patterns that you mentioned were attribute based and role based, right?
Yep.
So are these something that you would design like ahead of time, or does your app kind of morph with more the more users it gets? Like how do you kind of decide? Do you decide it before you design your app, or do you kind of change as needs go?
That is such a fantastic question. So there is, so I think roles is one where I think you do have a, oh, where to begin? You've like hit on a topic which is like potentially a whole other talk. I think when authorization is done like really, really well, it's very clear and understandable from a user experience perspective, and it's it kind of molds to your application data structure, and it doesn't like force you to doing unnatural things. So like I think roles is one where you do have some degree to like choose which one you want. So like the I spoke about like, do you need one role per organization or multiple roles per organization? It depends on your app. Like if you're building an app and your expectation is like, my users are always going to belong to just one company and only one company because, it's an expense app. It'd be a bit weird if they're expensing multiple companies, then like, great, have like one role model. You probably noticed in mid example, you're probably like, well, like contractors might expense multiple organizations, and then okay, there you have it. Like maybe you do need multiple roles. And so a lot of this authorization academy chapter on roles talks you through like what like for these different role models, when do you need that? So we talk about what the model is, how to implement it, and like when you should use it. And so we talk about these kind of like which one of these you kind of have and when to apply them. For the next chapter of this we have actually coming out on hopefully on Thursday, is talking more about like relationships. So things like repository belongs to an organization. Those are way more just like, that is how your app is structured, and it's a case of like recognizing that your app is structured in that way, that there is a like a relevant authorization model to apply. I think between those two, you're going to have like probably 95% of your use case like down like really good. I think like roles and some concept of relationship, like you can get really far. For the one-off things, like don't look for ABAC. You'll know when it comes up because you'll be like, this doesn't quite feel like a role. It's like public repositories. Like, I have that field. I want to like, I have a field. I have a column in my database, and I want to do a different authorization based on the value. It's like, it's inherent to your app. It's not something you need to like search out and be like, I want ABAC because it sounds cool. Unfortunately, that's like a lot of information out there kind of speaks about things that way.
I mean, would you say like the short version would be like, or just like the oversimplification of this would be like, if you're dealing with users belonging to one organization always in your app, we should use attributes, and if they could potentially be members of different organizations with multiple roles, then we do role-based?
I would say the first one is roles. Yeah.
Or is that not totally right either?
This kind of shows the problem of like despite there not being a roles table in the like one user to organization thing, this is roles still, right? There's this like organization role field. The thing you've hit on is like attribute based access control covers kind of everything. Like in some ways it's like roles are a form of relationship is a form of attribute. So like everything is an attribute, most things are relationships. The kind of the thing that roles get you is, and the thing that we try to like cover here, is kind of like a mental model for how to think about giving access. And like roles is going to be like, you're going to give a name to a group of permissions and you're going to tell your user, here's what you can do in the app. Roles is like a very user facing thing. And so yeah.
Cool, thanks. I'll look into
All right.
it more.
I see a question from Ron as well. Hey, Ron.
Hey, I had a few questions about, you called that language Polar. That's something you invented?
Yes. Yeah. So we created Polar specifically for, I mean, it doesn't have
So
like,
is
yeah.
do you compile that into JavaScript? Is it parsed and on the fly, or?
Yeah. So the way this gets like added into your application, So you basically read this file in at like startup. It gets loaded into like the OSO library, the OSO instance. The language is actually implemented. The core language is implemented in Rust, and we kind of have, you know, like language bindings, language integrations, so that it can work with, you know, JavaScript and Python and Ruby and Java and things like that. And then so basically there's like, you know, the main piece is the implementation of the language, and there's like a kind of a thin wrapper on top for like the Node library that handles the, you know, doing things like looking up the attributes on a thing, or like checking the types are right. So that's kind of like the piece the Node library does on top. And so yeah.
So it's parsed every time the application starts up.
Yep. So you read in the file once start up, and then from there it's like loaded into OSO, ready to answer queries.
And do you like go through an intermediate step? Because you mentioned several languages that it can parse it so that it's readable by, like, you go
Yeah.
through an
No, so this
abstract syntax tree or something, or
no, so it's the same. So the Polar language that I'm showing here, it's the same. It looks the same in every language. The only difference is on, you know, accessing fields. So like in this example repository.ownerid, like the Polar language doesn't actually manipulate the repository. It just will basically ask back to JavaScript, hey, I've got this like repository thing. It's, you know, an opaque object to me. It's like object number 3. I have object number 3, and I want to look up the owner ID on it. And Node will just come back and say, oh yeah, owner ID is 5. And it's like, cool, I know what 5 is. I can compare it to 6, and they're not equal. So that's basically like the language evaluation is able to, it does like just the logical steps, but it leaves like interacting with the data to like the JavaScript side of things.
okay, thanks.
All right. I never quite got around to saying this, so there's just a couple of links here. I'm going to post them in the Zoom chat. And Steffi has helpfully already posted a link to Authorization Academy. It's basically where you can find out more about us as a company and what we're all about, documentation for the library and how to use it. And the final one, so, you know, everything I've been speaking about tonight is part of our open source offering. We have a growing community around using OSO, and so we have the Slack available for any conversations about the open source product, authorization more generally, just to hang out and chat and share cool stuff you're working on. Yeah, that's a good place to come and ask us questions. I myself hang out there most of the time, but we also have like the engineering team hanging around to ask questions, answer questions and things like that in the Slack. Cool. Thank you everyone for participating and listening and asking questions and everything. This has been great.
Thank you.